Morning people, welcome back to F Politics. Today is another lesson in whether or not black and brown people can be racist and xenophobic, because Home Secretary Shabana Mahmood announced the UK government's new policy on refugees, and she was called out by a Lib Dem MP, and it went like this.
But what is not helpful is the Home Secretary claiming that the country is being torn apart by immigration. Acknowledging the challenges facing our nation is one thing, but stoking division by using immoderate language is quite another.
Fully agree. Because when the Home Secretary said
illegal migration is creating division across our country,
she's blaming foreigners. She's blaming immigration, the people coming to the UK. She's blaming the foreigners, not the politicians who are stoking hatred against foreigners. Also, it's not illegal immigration, because under the Refugee Convention, people have the right to claim asylum in any other country. It only becomes illegal if they enter that country and don't claim asylum, or they overstay a visa or something. And Shabana Mahmood responds with this.
I have to say to the Honourable Gentleman, I wish I had the privilege of walking around this country and not seeing the division that the issue of migration and asylum system is creating across this country. Unlike him, unfortunately, I am the one that is regularly called a fucking packy and told to go back home. It is I who knows through my personal experience and that of my constituents just how divisive the issue of asylum has become.
Okay, but that's worse. I mean, you do get how that's worse, right?
Because the translation of that is, I'm brown, therefore I experience racism, therefore I know firsthand that right-wing rhetoric around immigration puts all ethnic minority people in this country in danger. Therefore, I can't be racist and xenophobic, and you, as a white man, can't know what you're talking about and can't call me out for spreading racism. She is literally using her skin color as a get out of racism and xenophobia free card. So let's look at what she's actually announced, because her opening remarks pretty much sound like anything you'd hear from a Tory or Reform Party speech.
Our world is a more volatile and more mobile place. Huge numbers are on the move. While some are refugees, others are economic migrants seeking to use and abuse our asylum system.
Listen to the words she says, because some are refugees implies just the minority are legitimately refugees, whereas others are just trying to game the system, which implies the majority are trying to game the system. But the numbers that were accessed from the Home Office show that the majority of people are coming from countries where there's a legitimate reason to flee those countries. And roughly 2/3 of asylum applications are successful, which means 2/3 of the people that are crossing those boats and applying for asylum are legitimately refugees. That number only dropped to 48% recently, and this is on the government website. They said that that's because of the new Nationality and Borders Act in 2022. And that new law explicitly penalized people who cross the channel without permission. So putting out the narrative that people who cross the channel in small boats to claim asylum aren't legitimately refugees and they're just after money is simply factually wrong. Worse still, she even attacks actual refugees.
And even genuine refugees are passing through other safe countries searching for the most attractive place to seek refuge.
Again, she's just parroting the stuff that far-right politicians always say, like saying that refugees cross through many safe countries to get to the UK, therefore they're not really in distress, which is an argument that implies that nobody should ever claim asylum in the UK unless the entirety of Europe, right up until our doorstep, was all in complete war. The idea that no refugee should come here because the Middle East is so far away is simply morally selfish. And refugee charities such as the Refugee Council have called this out, saying that people aren't just shopping around for which country to go to, they're coming to the UK largely because they might have family here or because English is their second language. And the reason that English is the second language for a lot of people is because of the UK's colonial past, going around the world telling everybody else to speak English, which means it's a direct reference to the UK's foreign policy, which makes it especially messed up for the UK to be complaining about refugee flows when UK foreign policy is often partly responsible for those refugee flows, because we've been destabilizing regions all across the world. Whether it's selling weapons to Saudi Arabia, which have been used to kill like 400,000 people in Yemen, whether it's selling weapons to Israel, which is being used to commit genocide in Gaza, which means that if you look at the UK's history as a whole, we went around the world, told everybody to speak English, then we destabilized their countries, meaning they had to then flee, and we were the only country that spoke the language that they speak, and so they come here. And for the record, only a tiny fraction actually come to the UK, but we'll get to that. But to then accuse those refugees of just shopping around for the best country is morally disgusting.
The burden that has fallen on this country has been heavy.
Like I said, most people who are fleeing war and persecution in the Middle East, for example, stay in countries that are near their home countries in the Middle least. And even within Europe, we take fewer people per capita than countries like France and Germany.
And over half of refugees remain on benefits 8 years after they have arrived.
Say, Shabby, you've been in power for like a year now. Have you changed the law to make it compulsory for employers to use anonymous job application processes to make sure that we don't have the situation where people with ethnic minority sounding names have to send between 70 and 90% more applications to get a call back from employers? Okay, so you've chosen to allow the situation where it is much harder for ethnic minorities to get jobs and get money and support themselves, and now you're pointing at refugees saying, hey, why are you still on benefits? That's interesting.
To the British public who foot the bill, the system feels out of control and unfair.
But the cost of asylum policy comes through taxation, and it's you, as the government, who decides which British people pay those taxes. You could choose to tax the rich, but you have ruled out raising income tax on the super rich. And this is the problem we always get with progressive policies, whether it's refugee policy or climate change. The cost of these policies, doing the right thing, should be paid for by the people that can actually afford it. And given that the UK has some of the highest levels of wealth inequality in the Western world, there are people in this country who can clearly afford it, but you're choosing not to burden them. Could that be because a lot of the people who used to fund the Conservative Party are now funding Labour? I don't know. And of course, Brexit, because remember, the Bank of England is effectively a branch of government. Yes, they're independent, but the government relies on the Bank of England for things like controlling inflation. And the Bank of England, effectively a branch of government, says that Brexit is costing the average household £1,000 a year. Which means that no refugee has or will ever cost the British people as much as the politicians who continue backing Brexit. So UK politicians don't get to blame refugees for putting a burden on UK taxpayers when UK politicians are still supporting a Brexit that is costing the UK government £40 billion a year in lost tax revenue.
The pace and scale of change has destabilised communities.
Has it? Because there are communities in the UK that are literally fighting the authorities, saying, you cannot take away our refugees, they are welcome here. So it's not necessarily people coming here that's destabilising communities, it's the concept of hostility between Brits and foreigners. But who's fueling that ideology? Who's fueling the idea that Brits and foreigners are somehow in opposition to each other? Probably politicians who say stuff like,
illegal migration is creating division across our country.
And you know what I love to see? I love to see politicians try and find new ways of saying, I'm not a racist, but.
There will never be a justification for the violence and racism of a minority. But if we fail to deal with this crisis, we will draw more people down a path that starts with anger and ends in hatred.
So the rioters who hunted ethnic minorities in the street last summer, they're wrong, but we have to do what they want anyway. It's the same strategy we've been seeing from Labour for months of, we have to basically copy reform, otherwise reform will take over. Then who are you doing this for? Because from our perspective, if you're just going to copy reform, you may as well be reform. Especially as the leaders of the Reform Party are now basically saying, well, Shabana, you may as well join us because you're doing what we want anyway. And charities like Refugee Action have pointed out the hypocrisy of complaining about foreigners not integrating while at the same time changing the law in this way.
By making refugee status temporary, not permanent. A grant of refugee status will last 2.5 years, not 5. It will be renewed only if it is impossible for a refugee to return home. Permanent settlement will now come at 20 years, not 5.
Making it so that refugees cannot be considered as part of British society for 20 years while complaining about refugees not integrating into British society is a wild stance to take. However, because this is not simply a Labour hate channel, I'm going to be honest with you and show you the positives.
We will create a new work and study visa route solely for refugees, with a quicker path to permanent settlement. We will open new, capped, safe and legal routes into this country. These will make sponsorship the primary means by which we resettle refugees, with voluntary and community organisations given greater involvement to both receive refugees and support them, working within caps set by government.
Which is why I've always said, if you want to completely stop people crossing the channel in small boats, fine, but you need to create safe and legal routes to claim asylum in the UK alongside that. But we'll need to see the details of how many routes she opens up, to which countries, what the numbers are, before we can actually pass judgment properly. But the problem is, even if we were to argue that opening these new routes counterbalances the hostility she's shown towards refugees and her other policies, if Labour is still putting out these right-wing narratives narratives of refugees are just gaming the system as economic migrants, or they're tearing this country apart, then they're being just as bad as Nigel Farage. They're stoking the very hatred that led to people with my skin tone being hunted in the street last summer. So in terms of whether or not black and brown people can be racist, it depends on your definition of racist, because too many people think that racist means you have to actively hate all people of a certain color and want them all to die. But that's stupid for two reasons. One, it ignores the concept of punching up versus punching down. Like, a poor person making fun of somebody for being rich isn't quite the same as a rich person making fun of somebody for being poor. And two, it's a lot harder in the modern world, especially with Gen Z and millennials, to get away with being overtly racist. So a more useful definition of racism and xenophobia is, are you upholding systems of racial and xenophobic hierarchy and division? And with Home Secretary Shabana Mahmood, the answer is clearly yes. The fact that she gets called the peace slur just means she knows exactly what kind of damage she's doing to millions of people. It arguably makes it worse. I'm Femi. Make sure you follow F Politics so politics doesn't F you. Have a great week.